As we approach Starship's next integrated flight test, SpaceX is working diligently towards their next testing milestones, with upgrades to the orbital tank farm being made, Booster 10 nearing completion, as well as an interesting update from Elon about the future of Starship. And make sure to stick around for some amazing aerial photos of Cape Canaveral. All that and more this week at SpaceX. Starting off this week at Starbase, the Sanchez site continues to see changes and new development. Rebar cages for new pilings were spotted being lifted for installation near the area recently vacated by the air separation tower. A bundle of shorter rebar was lifted into the site's new building as its construction appears to be nearing structural completion. A new three-legged white steel structure was spotted near the engine installation stand area. Could this be part of an access platform for the new stands? Let us know your thoughts below. On Friday, crews continued to install the windows on the new Mega Bay. These windows are being installed much earlier in the construction process than they were on the first Mega Bay. It did not receive windows until months after its roof was completed. Down at the launch site, work is progressing on the new walls and the gate at the corner of the launch site. The concrete beam across the D1 gate has now been poured and the forms removed. Crews also began painting the wall between the gate and the black section of the wall that recently received the Gateway to Mars sign. A new piece of hardware was seen being lifted and installed onto the top of one of the chopstick arms. It's not yet clear what this is, but it might be framework for a new walkway for worker access. Nerdle caught crews setting up framework for a new concrete wall. This wall will be at the backside of the first 3 horizontal cryogenic storage tanks recently added to the tank farm. On Friday afternoon, a 12-axle SPMT was driven down Highway 4 to the launch site, indicating that SpaceX was planning to move something large at the pad. What was to be moved quickly became apparent. The rear hood of the booster quick disconnect was connected to a crane and removed from the launch mount. It was then placed onto the recently arrived SPMT to be moved out of the way. Once secured to the SPMT, the quick disconnect hood was driven across the launch site and placed in the new parking lot near the test stand tank farm. Also that afternoon, crews began demolishing the storage building that was built along Highway 4 last year in front of the methane tanks. This building has taken damage in both flight tests, indicating that it's just not robust enough for its location. Throughout the afternoon, workers continued to remove the exterior cladding and then the roofing on the roadside building. What do you think's going to go in its place? Knock yourself out in the comments. Later, having finished the wiring of the lights on the new Gateway to Mars sign, workers walked down the line of letters testing their lights as they walked along. Back over at the chopsticks, a second new potential walkway framing section was lifted by crane and installed on the top of Mechazilla's other arm. On Saturday, demolition of the roadside storage shed continued. Crews began by removing the final interconnecting pieces. Next, they moved on to the U-shaped steel structure elements. On Sunday, window installation continued on Mega Bay 2. Crews worked their way along the left side of the building, where Sentinel caught them placing the final full-size window panel for that side. Back at the launch site, the demolition of the roadside storage building continued. The final pieces of steel were removed and excavators worked to remove the concrete below. On Monday morning, a new hot stage ring was attached to one of the Mega Bay bridge cranes and lifted onto Booster 10, located on the engine installation stand in the back left corner. The installation of this article moves the booster one step closer to its trip to the launch mount. A short time later, Sentinel Cam caught a concrete pump truck working to place the foundations for the next phase of the Star Factory expansion. A rare glimpse inside the now active section of the Star Factory allowed us to see a booster forward section as well as a tank section working their way through production in the facility. That afternoon, Ship 33's midlock section was moved to the scrapyard. Elon recently stated that Ship 32 will be the last of what he called version 1 of Starship, with version 2 having larger propellant tanks, reduced dry mass, and improved reliability. We'll have to stay on the lookout for those upgrades. As darkness enveloped Starbase for the night, the new Gateway to Mars sign was switched on in its entirety for the first time. This drastically improves the vibe when approaching the launch site after dark. Shortly after midnight Tuesday morning, the first of the new generation of booster transport stands once again made its way out of the Sanchez site and into the ring yard. Unlike the previous trip to the ring yard, however, the stand did not stay there long. About 4 hours later, it was rolled into Mega Bay 1. That afternoon, the end of Booster 10's latest stay in Mega Bay 1 was rapidly approaching. The Super Heavy was lifted off the engine installation stand and placed onto the new transport ring just inside the doorway of the building. Over at Massey's, we can now see metal studs have been added to the office portion of the new building, while we are still waiting to see the bridge crane installed. Throughout the week, the glaziers continue to make steady progress on the windows across the front of the upper level of Mega Bay 2. The windows on this latest bay are noticeably taller than we saw on either High Bay or Mega Bay 1, with 2 panes of glass in each installed panel. Work also continued with the removal of the building next to the D2 gate at the launch site. Crews used heavy equipment to remove all the concrete from below where the building sat along Highway 4. Nearby the orbital tank farm is a hive of activity. A worker was spotted welding one of the feet on the new tanks to the steel embed on the pedestals below. New piping is also arriving and being lifted into the farm for installation. Seeing the workers up close to one of the new prefabricated piping sections really gives us a sense of scale on just how large the piping in the tank farm really is. Up the road, at the Star Factory, workers continue on the expansion's roof. Workers push to complete the 2 taller sections on the way to getting the area operational. Tuesday afternoon, back over at the launch site, the ship quick disconnect arm was swung out away from the tower. Later, the reason for the QD arm move became apparent. The chopsticks made their way up the tower and then back down, likely testing the arms out following some post-launch repairs. That evening, Booster 10 was secured on the new transport stand, and it was then rolled out of Mega Bay 1. The booster was then moved out of the ring yard onto Highway 4 before entering the Sanchez site next to the ground fabrication building and working its way to the rocket garden. This is likely a short-term spot for the Super Heavy while SpaceX continues to get the launch mount ready for testing. Crews removed some of the barriers and fencing around the next phase of the Star Factory. This gave us a peek at work being done there as they continue to prepare the ground for the floor slab. A bunch of Starlink ground stations were spotted by Chief at the Sanchez site. Since there are already 9 installed near the village, it would appear that SpaceX is upgrading the Starbase ground stations. By Thursday, all of the concrete had been removed from the footprint on the roadside building at the launch site, and crews began grading the area to prepare for fresh concrete. Also on Thursday, an interesting steel delivery was spotted turning into the ring yard before unloading at the next phase of the Star Factory expansion. This steel appears to be much more substantial than what we saw throughout the earlier construction. It will be interesting to see how this next section of the building differs from what has already been built. Down at the launch site, the last of the forms and bracing were removed from the freshly poured concrete beams across the D1 gate. On Saturday morning, over at Cape Canaveral, SpaceX rolled out their next Falcon Heavy rocket at Launch Complex 39A, ahead of its static fire tests to prepare for the USSF-52 mission. That afternoon, Tug Crosby's skipper was spotted towing Just Read the Instructions out to sea in support of booster recovery for the Starlink Group 6-33 launch. Late that night, Falcon 9 Booster 1078 launched from Space Launch Complex 40 on its 6th mission, delivering another 23 Starlink V2 minis to low Earth orbit. On Sunday, Dragon recovery vessel Shannon headed out of Port Canaveral on its way to Tampa Bay in preparation for the upcoming return of the CRS-29 mission. At noon Eastern, 27 Merlin engines roared to life at Launch Complex 39A as SpaceX performed a static fire of their Falcon Heavy rocket to ensure it is ready for its next launch. That evening, Bob departed from Port Canaveral, heading downrange to join Crosby's skipper and Just Read the Instructions in supporting the Starlink Group 6-33 launch. On Tuesday, Falcon 9 Booster 1062 finished its dockside processing and was moved to the transporter for its return to SpaceX's refurbishment facilities at Roberts Road. That afternoon, Doug returned to port with both fairing halves that it recovered following the launch of the Starlink Group 6-31 mission 2 days earlier. On Tuesday, Blue Origin's new dockside crane was spotted lifting a ring with what looks like clamps on the top and installing it onto their newly arrived steel structure. From a recent meeting of the board commissioners, we learned that this is a breakover fixture that will be used to lay down New Glenn boosters after they return to port. A short time later, Cygnet Titan towed a short follow gravitas back into port with Falcon 9 Booster 1078 following its successful launch of the Starlink Group 6-31 mission. Several hours later, the booster was lifted off the deck of the drone ship and transferred to the dockside stand for processing ahead of its return to Roberts Road. On Wednesday, Doug headed back out to sea, this time heading much further downrange than normal for fare and recovery operations of the USS F-52 Falcon Heavy mission. Shortly after midnight Eastern on Thursday morning, fire roared from SpaceX Launch Complex 40 for the second time in just 4 days as SpaceX launched yet another Starlink mission. That afternoon, Tug's Cygnet Titan and a short follow gravitas departed from Port Canaveral for their next booster recovery for the Starlink Group 6-34 mission. Once again, the great Greg Scott and Farielle Mohan took to the Florida skies this week to bring us a flyover update. At Launch Complex 39B, Mobile Launcher 2 is still at the pad finishing up its post-refurbishment testing campaign. In the near future, the crawler should come pick it up and return it to the vehicle assembly building for stacking operations for Artemis 2. Just outside the vehicle assembly building, work is well underway of the construction of the second mobile launcher. Once built, it will be used to support the larger Block 1B and Block 2 variants of NASA's SLS rocket. At Historic Launch Complex 39A, SpaceX was preparing for their upcoming Falcon Heavy launch, while the stalled Starship tower continues to watch from the sidelines. To the south, at Space Launch Complex 40, man lifts could be seen around the new crew access tower as they work to get the new infrastructure online. The new tower is likely to be used to support a Dragon launch early next year. Once it's online, it'll be interesting to see if the redundancy for manned launches prompts SpaceX to restart work on Starship infrastructure at 39A, or if they'll continue to wait until they have a few successful orbital launches under their belt. Over at SpaceX's Robert Road facility, we can see action around the prefabricated tower sections for the first time in a while. Most of the hardware for the unassembled top 2 sections have been shipped to Starbase. Crews could be seen working in the area where one of the sections bolts to the fabrication and transportation jig, likely making sure the section is ready for a sea voyage to Texas in the near future. Similarly, workers were once again visible around the chopsticks and QD arm. Presumably, these chopsticks will follow this tower to Texas. It's not yet clear, however, if this QD arm will go to 39A or to Starbase. Also at Roberts Road, the large vertical tanks that were originally at Starbase before being barged to Florida have been moved from 39A to Roberts Road. SpaceX has been storing these tanks for several years now, and it's not yet clear where they will eventually end up. On the back side of the Roberts Road Star Factory, work is underway on an addition to the building. Reports are that SpaceX is now using this facility for Falcon 9 payload integration, so it seems likely that this addition is in service to that new use. While it's not clear what purpose it will serve, it is clear that this new section is looking quite substantial with large foundations and poured concrete walls. Things also seem to be ramping up at the Blue Origin's Florida facilities. At the site's South Campus, it appears that the current phase of construction is reaching its end. The warehouse addition, the Reef Pathfinder building, the vertical assembly building, and the new tent all appear to be complete. At the North Campus, several large wooden crates were seen lined up outside behind the manufacturing building. A small tent has also been added to the building's north side. A lot of equipment that was previously stored outside of the manufacturing building has been moved to a much more organized storage area out in front of the tank cleaning and testing facility. Over by the shuttle landing facility, the Project Comet payload processing facility for Amazon's Kuiper satellites is coming along nicely. The roofing is now being added and the cladding is being added to the exterior walls. By the next flyover, the building should be weather tight with crews working through the interior fit out. Over at the port, Greg caught a great Scott of a shot of the new Glen breakover fixture with its base in a slightly rotated position, giving a glimpse of how it will work. At United Launch Alliance's Space Launch Complex 41, the first Vulcan rocket was out to the pad ahead of a wet dress rehearsal. Assuming everything goes well, the rocket should roll back to the hangar for payload integration ahead of its planned Christmas Eve inaugural launch. And finally for this week, Farielle was able to catch a submarine tied up at the dock in the Port Canaveral's Trident turning basin. This relatively quiet area of the Port Canaveral docks is completely within the Space Force station and is regularly used by the Navy to service their submarines. And there you have it, another SpaceX and Starbase weekly update brought to you by LabPadre. Don't forget to hit the subscribe and like button if you haven't already, and we'll see you next week. Thanks for watching. LabPadre out.